Good evening and welcome to this webinar on how to pre-think assumptions. My name is Rajat Sidana. I'm one of the co-founders of e-GMAT and I'm going to be your main host today. Supporting me in this webinar is Sandeep. Sandeep is a GMAT strategy expert at e-GMAT, and he's going to make sure that, your questions around GMAT preparation are answered if you have any during this webinar. In this webinar, we're going to talk about pre-thinking. Pre-thinking is one of the most popular techniques to ace critical reasoning. We're going to specifically focus on pre-thinking for assumptions. e-GMAT was one of the first companies that formalized the pre-thinking approach about 10 years back, and we built on that approach ever since, refining it over the course of last decade or so. And in this webinar, we're going to just tell you how to go about doing pre-thinking, what's a methodical way of approaching pre-thinking so that you can answer an assumption question correctly every time. Even though we'll focus just on assumption questions, this approach is pretty much applicable to strengthen, weaken, evaluate, fill in the blanks questions. And in fact, in a modified form, a slightly more modified form of this approach is also applicable to boldface questions. Fundamentally, any questions that involve arguments, you can use this approach. Since this is a fairly application-focused webinar, we did send a few video lessons your way. The two video lessons that I really wanted you to watch are Introduction to Assumption and Pre-Thinking Logical Gap. Let's just do a quick yes/no poll and see how many of you have gone through these video lessons. Let's just get in the poll over here, and let's reopen the poll. So how many of you have seen at least one, probably two of these video lessons? Just a simple yes/no poll over here. All right, about 45% of you. The other 55% who have not posted this webinar, these are a part of your free trial. Log into your e-GMAT account. You can watch them, and it'll actually multiply the benefit that you'd have from this webinar. All right, with that, let me minimize this. We also have some upcoming free webinars, and we have a free webinar on GMAT Algebra. That's tomorrow, 24 hours from now. In this webinar, we're going to focus on inequalities and absolute value, two topics that most people struggle with, and we're going to see how using a simplified approach you can solve the easiest as well as the most challenging questions in these two topics. And then next week, and I think as part of the next webinar, it's prudent to kind of get another poll question here, which is what's your target GMAT score? Let's get some data point. That it also helps me profile this entire group. So the question is, what's your target GMAT score? I have about 150 responses. Let me just look at the engagement dashboard for the webinar. Yeah, about 150, 166, 169 responses or so. And what you see is that about 90% of the class is aiming for a score of 7, 10 or higher. If you are aiming for that score, attend our webinar next week on GMAT strategy. In this webinar, we're going to talk about how to create a study plan for any GMAT score. In fact, I'm going to give you just a brief overview of that for about 4 minutes right now, and then this entire webinar is going to talk about building that study plan, creating those customized metrics for you, and then tracking those metrics as you study. So again, if you have not registered for this one, that's what exactly a week from now. You can click on this register now button. All right, with that, we already have this data. 65% if you're aiming for that score of 760 or higher. Now I want to ask two other questions, and this is again, this data is fun. I'm someone who looks at data a lot, and this is one fun question that I ask, and the question says, COVID-19 crisis has, and the three options which are there are, made me question my decision, not change my plans, or push me towards doing an MBA. Doing MBA. All right, so this is a very interesting chat. Let's get another question over here. We have about 170 odd responses to this one. Let's get another question. So this question says, when compared to 2019's admission cycle, 2020 admission cycle is expected to be, what do you think? Is it going to be less competitive, just as competitive, or more competitive? Let's get a similar number of responses. There's about 170, 180 odd responses. Yeah, cool. Let me just broadcast the results. 70% of you say more competitive, and that is absolutely correct. And the reason for that being more competitive is the percentage of people who've chosen option 3, which has pushed me towards doing an MBA. You can see 35% of you. Now, consider, I mean, I agree this is a biased group, but even in general, way more people are expected to go for their MBA or apply to B schools in this current cycle. And the second reason, than have ever done so in the past decade. And the second reason is a lot of deferrals from 2019. They're going to apply again in 2020. So this is expected to be probably the most competitive cycle of the decade. Okay, with that, thank you. Let me just move these polls, move them away. And when do you plan to take the GMAT? You can really see we have a fairly, let's say, well-balanced group with the exception of the last choice where about 40% of you have fallen. But there's no, I mean, there's no group which is less than 10% and nothing that's overwhelmingly huge, which means there's no majority here. So this is good. We have students who've either just started their preparation or students who are just about to get done with their preparation. With that, let me go right into the webinar pane. Now, as we come to this webinar pane, a few things. You're going to see a presentation. You're going to see a Q&A or a question and answer part right below the presentation. The presentation should say CR1 Prethinking for Assumptions. Let me just put in this yes, no question again. Select yes if you're seeing CR1 Prethinking for Assumptions. Now, below the presentation pod, you're going to see a Q&A or a question and answer pod. And in the Q&A pod, if you have a question during the presentation, during the session, you can post that question over here. Okay. So essentially, 3 parts of this webinar. In the first part, I'm going to just briefly talk about how can you build that study plan if you want to do that right away. We have a few slots for that. In the second part, we're going to get into the core of this webinar. It's going to be about 2 hours after that starts. So, and again, give or take about 10% depending on the number of questions you guys have. And then towards the end, I've been doing these webinars for about 10 years. And a lot of people have questions which are outside of critical reasoning, which pertain to other topics of the GMAT, the questions that pertain to, in general, MBA application. I'd be happy to answer those questions as long as you post them towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so with that, let me start with the first part, which is, hey, how preparing for your MBA. So for those of you who don't know about e-GMAT, we are one of the top test prep companies on GMAT Club. If you go to the review section, you're going to really see that that we have way more reviews than any of the other prep companies out there. And one of the reasons why we have that is because our learning architecture is built more around that of a private tutor where we give you feedback every 30 minutes. That architecture leads to much higher success rate. Most of the other prep companies still have this, what we call as a book-based approach, where they just make you learn things without giving you feedback, and then they give you a bunch of exercises. We do much more integrated learning. We give you feedback every 30 minutes. We correct you every 30 minutes if you're not learning properly, which, way more corrections or lead to you following the right path, which leads to success. So with that, let's just talk about creating that right path for a moment, and let's see how you get to that 720 or higher score. So how do you do that? Let's say you're someone who's starting at a score of 600. The first thing you'd have to really do is you have to create a path towards that goal, which is, hey, define a target quant score, a target verbal score, figure out what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and once you've figured out the key things where you need to improve upon, you need to learn the concepts in those areas. Then you need to learn how to apply those concepts. Why? Because application matters. Knowing the concepts is more or less immaterial when it comes to solving questions, or more or less, I'd say it's about 10% of the job, but knowing how to apply is that 90%. So you need to do that. And then you need to attain that level of mastery that puts you in the top 4, top 5 percentile, or if you're aiming for that 760 score, top 1 percentile of the students. Now, as I said, let's take a case of someone who's aiming for that score of 720 and is starting at a score of 600. So the first thing you'd have to really do is you've got to figure out that score of 600, what abilities does this comprise of? Because the GMAT tests you or evaluates 5 abilities overall. So that score of 720 is built out of 5 abilities. That score of 600 is comprises of 5 abilities. Now, how do you figure out those abilities? You take a mock test or you take an official GMAT and essentially get what is called as an enhanced score report. So since taking the official test is very expensive and then you need to pay about 30 bucks on top of it to get an enhanced score report, what we recommend is take a Sigma X mock. It's the world's only mock that gives you an ESR analysis. Okay. So once you take a Sigma X mock, it gives you those 5 abilities, 3 in verbal and 2 in quant. Then you essentially set your target milestones that will help you get to that 720 score. So there are about 50 ways in which you can achieve that 720 score. Which one's the right one for you? We built a tool called GMAT Planner that helps you figure out which one's the right one for you based on your starting abilities. So think of it as a neural network that maps your starting abilities, maps your background to what your target score needs to be. It goes through about 300 to 400 different combinations for every target score. If you go to GMAT Planner, you can really do that. Just an interface of how it looks like is let's say you have a current set of quant and verbal scores, which are Q44 and V28 that comprise of your 600. Based on this, it first defines a target quant, target verbal score, and then it tells you what abilities should you aim for to achieve a Q50 and a V38. Okay. From there on, it takes into account how many hours you can put in every day during the weekdays and during the weekends, and then assigns how much time would you need to go from your starting ability, which is over here, to your target milestones, which is what was defined in the GMAT planner. And then from there on, it gives you your day-by-day plan. Again, you can really see your input, which is how many hours you put in during the weekday versus during the weekend over here. So again, this is completely customized. It's a tool that we built about a year and a half ago, and our students have built more than 10,000 personalized study plans using this tool. And here are some examples of people who benefited from the study plans that have come out of this tool overall. All right. With that, if you want to connect with me and if you want to know about all things GMAT, you can connect with me on my LinkedIn. Just search for Rajat Siddhana on LinkedIn, and we share about 5 or 6 articles every week. We keep you updated on everything that's going on in the GMAT and MBA world. Let me just hide this over here. Okay. Let's get to the core of this particular webinar. So with that, we're going to really start with this with understanding how you approach critical reasoning questions today. So we're going to figure out what your current approach is. I'm going to give you a pre-thinking exercise. We're going to start with 2 simple arguments. These are going to be plain arguments, no answer choices. All you're going to do is we're going to figure out how to do pre-thinking. And we're going to use these 2 arguments as a foundation of building the pre-thinking process. Then we're going to solve not 2 but 3. So I've added a bonus question to this webinar. So 3 full-length questions. These are 3 difficult questions. These are 3 official questions. So the first 2 arguments are e-GMAT arguments. These are used to learn how to pre-think. And then the 3 questions are official questions, difficult questions, probably the most challenging questions you're going to see under the assumption section. And so we're going to solve these questions as a quiz. Then we're going to review them. And as we review them, we're going to apply pre-thinking. We're going to apply the negation test. And then we'll really look at how can you now build upon this approach now that you're familiar with this approach, and where can you get more practice. So at a very high level, we'll document how you prepare today. Then we're going to look at how do you do pre-thinking. And then we'll tell you where should you go from there. Okay, so let's discuss your current approach to critical reasoning. And with that, I see a few of you have raised hands. Let me just put this over here. And Let me just clear the questions in the Q&A pod. So let's talk about your current approach to critical reasoning. Now, before we talk about your approach, let me just define what pre-thinking is. Pre-thinking is thinking of one and only one potential assumption in your mind in 15 seconds before you look at the answer choices. And the three parts in quotes are really important. An argument can have multiple assumptions. When we do pre-thinking, we only look at one of those assumptions. The idea of pre-thinking is not to predict the answer, but to understand the logic that the author is using. The second thing is pre-thinking needs to be done in about 15 seconds. Okay, a skilled pre-thinker is able to do this in less than 15 seconds. If you look at any of the 100 odd success stories that we have on our YouTube channel, you're going to really see most of these guys are able to do it in about 10 seconds or so. And then you do pre-thinking before you look at answer choices. The moment you start looking at answer choices, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. Why? Because every answer choice adds new information which pollutes your mind. We don't want to do that while doing pre-thinking. Okay. And the thing that I want to make sure I want to precisely define this is because we were the first company that came up with this definition, and it's fairly standard and for at least for most companies right now. But even today, some companies equate pre-thinking to predicting the answer. We are not trying to predict the answer. Pre-thinking is a tool to understand author's logic, the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. Okay, so with that, let's understand the two methodologies that people follow. One is, they read the argument, they directly go to answer choices and do back and forth between the argument and answer choices till they reach the final candidate. The second is they read the argument, they focus on pre-thinking, and then they look at the answer choices, they come back or refer back to the argument only when needed. So which methodology do you follow? Let's kind of look at this. How do you approach assumption questions, or in general, argument-based critical reasoning questions today? Let's get a few more responses. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. And this is what we see is about a 50-50 split. But half the folks follow methodology 1, the other half follow methodology 2. So my goal would be folks who follow methodology 2, I want to make sure that post this webinar, you're way better at following methodology 2. If you follow methodology 1, which is the non-pre-thinking approach, then uh, uh, then what we want to really do is make sure that that you start following the pre-thinking approach. Okay, is there a sound that comes when people exit? Because I don't hear that sound. Let me just put in a poll over here. Select yes if you see a sound that comes in when people exit. Is there a sound that you see? Okay, about half of you hear a sound, the other half don't. Let me just see if I can do that. Um, okay, I guess when someone raises the hand, okay. All right, let me just change that to, ah, all right, I'm going to disable hand raise right now so that I've just done that. Can you guys try and raise a hand? And let's just see if you guys, okay. Do you guys still hear a sound? Select no if you don't hear a sound anymore. All right, this is much better. So I've disabled people raising hands, and that's good. Perfect. Okay, perfect. So with that, let's talk about where people spend their time overall. So if you follow methodology 2, what you're going to find is that which is the pre-thinking approach. If you follow the pre-thinking approach, then what you're going to find is that you spend the biggest chunk of your time reading and understanding the argument. On the other hand, if you follow the non-pre-thinking approach where you read the argument, do not do pre-thinking, but go directly to the answer choices, you're going to spend a good chunk of your time evaluating the answer choices. So the methodology that you follow defines where you spend time. Not only defines actually the accuracy that you get to, but also where you spend time overall. Okay. Now, in this webinar, in addition to pre-thinking, now pre-thinking is a tool, but it assumes that you read well. So to make sure that you're able to use pre-thinking, we're going to focus on these three skills. We're going to focus on how can you visualize the conclusion in your own words. A lot of people think they read properly, they don't visualize information enough. Okay, so we're going to look at how to visualize that conclusion in your own words, and and we'll also look at how to visualize the answer choices in your own words as well. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to understand and build this logical structure to understand the logic that the author is using to arrive at the conclusion. And the last piece we're going to do is we're going to learn how to formulate the falsification question. Now, this piece over here is what's essential for pre-thinking. But everything else is something that these are core skills to solve any critical reasoning question. So they're not specific to pre-thinking, but any method you use, you need to learn how to visualize the conclusion, and you need to know how to uh, how to build that logical structure. Okay, with that, we've been talking about assumptions. So let's understand what an assumption is, and to do that, let me put in a short answer poll over here. Let's just get my short answer poll over here, and I'm going to show an argument that is very close to your heart. I want you to tell me, what does the author assume over here? All right, I have about 90 responses, and most of them are really good responses. Now, this is evidence that once you understand, once you're able to visualize the argument, pre-thinking starts to come very natural. This is an argument that you can visualize very easily. So what's the argument? Joe scored 500 on the GMAT. There, and based on this data point, so there's this data point that the author provides to you, the author concludes that therefore he, which is Joe, will not get admission in an Ivy League college. So he kind of makes what we call as a logical jump over here. Now, while making this logical jump, what the author assumes is that a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges, which is something uh, 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 that many of you have been able to come up with. In a sense, you've been able to understand the logic that the author is using. Now, the only thing that I want to improve upon most of your answers is this part over here, which is for someone like Joe. Why? Because in the conclusion, the author is saying that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. Author is not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia will not get admission in an Ivy League college. He's saying Joe will not get admission. And the point that I want to make sure is when it comes to an assumption, it's very closely mated to the conclusion. So again, when we say visualize the conclusion, the reason we say visualize the conclusion is because, hey, the assumption is going to be very, very closely related to that. Okay. So with that, let's kind of move forward. Now, since you guys know what an assumption is, why don't you formally define what is an assumption? So put in the formal definition of an assumption. So once again, what does the author assume over here? What's the formal definition of assumption? Okay, let's have 46 responses. Let's get to 50 before I broadcast results. All right, I have 50 responses over here. Okay, implied, not written explicitly, but backed by evidence in the para. All right, what is relatable to the passage? A missing information that helps get to the conclusion. Something which makes the conclusion true, something which is 100% true. Okay. So again, even though intuitively you guys understand assumption, even though in a scenario that you're very familiar with, you're able to come up with assumptions, you guys don't have a clear understanding of what an assumption is. What's the formal definition of assumption? So let's kind of look at it. And an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. There are two important parts to it. First of all, an assumption provides new information, which is where the unstated idea piece comes. What this means is, given an argument, for the correct assumption, the information from the correct assumption will not be inferable from the factual part of the argument. Okay. So for the correct assumption, you won't be able to infer that information from the factual part of the argument. The second piece is that an assumption is required for the conclusion to be valid, which means that without the assumption, the conclusion can break down. Now, for 98% of the questions, assumption questions test this part. 98% of the assumption questions will test the must be true aspect of the condition. Only about 2% of assumption questions test this aspect. And then there's a reason for this. Why? Because rarely, if you were testing aspect number one, you'd probably do it in an inference question. You don't need to give an assumption question. Okay. So with having said that, okay, it's really important to know that the correct answer choice will A, provide new information, and B, satisfy the must be true condition. Now, assumption is like physics, which means that, hey, for critical reasoning in general is like physics, which means if you understand this definition and if you know how to apply it, you should be able to solve each and every question that is there. Okay. So let's kind of do some visualization. Let's assume this particular argument is like this house where the roof is your conclusion. Remember, these three pillars and you have the roof. The roof is the conclusion. The three pillars that you see over here, these three pillars are holding this roof upright. So in other words, each of these three pillars is a supporting statement. All right. Now, are each one of these, is each one of these three pillars an assumption? Not necessarily. An assumption is only the essential pillar which is required for this roof to stay upright. So in this case, only the middle pillar is required. If, for example, only the middle pillar is required to keep this roof upright, only that one is an assumption. The other two, are what we call as strengtheners or supporting pillars. So they still make the conclusion or the roof stronger, but they are not required, which means I could essentially knock this off, and the roof or the conclusion will still stay there. But if I decide to knock this thing off, the roof will cave in. Okay, so that's the must be true aspect of the assumption. Okay, so what does must be true mean? And this is really deep, because as we solve questions, I'm going to come back to this definition, because you're going to choose an answer choice that's an incorrect answer choice, and you're going to be confused. Why is this not the correct assumption? And I'm going to come back to this definition of what the must be true aspect, and you're going to then understand why that's the case. So what does must be true mean? It means that if the information provided by assumption is not true, then the conclusion can no longer hold true. Or, in other words, the definition, the assumption must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. All right. With that, let's talk about one aspect of it, what is called as falsification of conclusion. And let's understand when you say what I've been talking about, this conclusion becomes invalid. Let's just talk about what does this mean. Okay. So under what scenario do you think will the conclusion become invalid? We have this same argument. Look at this argument again and tell me, when will the conclusion? Most of you are getting it right, which is if someone makes it, or if Joe makes it to an Ivy League college with a score of 500 or lower. Okay, so falsification or destroying the conclusion means that Joe gets admission with that score of 500 or even with a lower score. Okay, is everyone clear? This is when the conclusion would become invalid. Okay. Right. And I know a few of you are hearing some sort of a beeping sound. I don't know why that is the case, and my apologies. Um, our next webinar, we're going to try and do it on um, on essentially a different platform. I'm sorry about this. I I don't know why you guys are facing this issue, to be very frank. One of the things that I can recommend is if you are able to join using the desktop client, not the browser version, you probably will not face it, because I know that there are a few folks from e-GMAT who are supporting me in this webinar, and these guys are not facing that issue. So if you download and if you join again, but don't join using the browser, but using the desktop client, then you probably won't face it. So that's something which I can tell you, because I know that people who are the folks who are using the desktop client over here, they're not facing it. And I know many of you are using the browser or HTML5 version, and I know you guys are facing it. Just to really tell you, we have these 286 students over here, and if your name is in blue, you're using the browser. If your name is in black, then you're using the desktop client, and you shouldn't be facing that issue then. Okay, so just again, my apologies for this. Aditi has confirmed the same thing. And yeah, so my apologies, guys. That's something that I would say. So again, let's go back. Let's talk about making the conclusion invalid. And uh, uh, yes, so again, and we'll have the recording, and the recording will be perfect, by the way. So with that, let's move forward. Okay, so let's see, how do you evaluate whether an answer choice is correct? Okay, so let's kind of look at our correct assumption that we looked at it, and let's apply the same test to this to really say, is this must be true? So the question that we're going to ask is, will Joe get admission, which means will the conclusion break down if the statement to the left no longer holds true? Now, here is something which is really important. Okay, when a statement no longer holds true, if we say a statement is invalid, then by definition, what we are really saying is that its negated instance becomes valid. Okay, so let's see what happens when its negated instance becomes valid. So negated instance of our assumption is that a score of 500 for someone like Joe is acceptable to Ivy League schools. So what happens when that becomes true? When that becomes true, what really happens is, does the conclusion break down? Absolutely. Why? Because if the score of 500 becomes acceptable, then the author cannot say with 100% certainty that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. This is essentially which breaking the conclusion down, because the conclusion breaks down if this particular statement is no longer true. This is what tells us that this is a correct or a valid assumption. Okay. This, what we just did, by the way, was apply the negation test. Now, many of you would be confused, which or maybe questioning to say, how can you really say that that if a statement is not true, its negated version automatically becomes true? How can you say that? How many of you are confused that when a statement is not true, its negated version automatically becomes true? How many of you are concerned that, okay, how did we arrive at that claim? Okay, about 60% of you are wondering, how can we say that? Let's kind of take some examples over there. Okay, and so essentially the principle is, if you say something's not true, by definition what you're saying is its negated version is true. Okay, let's take some examples. Harvard has the best MBA program. If you say that this statement is not true, in other words, what you are also saying is that Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or an MBA program which is just as good as Harvard or even better than Harvard exists. Isn't that true? If you say, hey, if you say this particular statement is not true, you are also, in a sense, saying that, even without saying it. This is what we call as drawing inferences from a single statement, and which is something that you learn before you go to assumptions if you're an e-GMAT student. If you say John runs faster than David, and if you say, hey, this part is not true, then what you're also saying is that David is just as fast, or David is faster than John, which, by the way, is a negated version of this particular statement. So essentially, when a statement is not true, its negated version becomes true. Okay. So this is what we call as the must be true test, which means that if an answer choice is a correct assumption, then the conclusion will break down in the presence of negated version of that answer choice. Why? Because it comes from that very definition of assumption, that an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Let's also look at the second part of it, which is what happens when you have an incorrect answer choice. If you put the same test, which is the negation test, to an incorrect answer choice, then the conclusion will not break down in the presence of negated instance of that answer choice. So let's take an answer choice that we're going to evaluate on the same argument. Okay, same argument. Let's take an answer choice which says, hey, a score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. Let's see if this is our correct assumption. We'll follow the same process. And we say, okay, the answer choice that I'm looking at is a score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. Let's ask ourselves, is this must be true, or will the conclusion break down if this statement is no longer true? Okay, so let's do that. If this statement is no longer true, then its negated instance becomes true, which means a score of 500 becomes a good score. If a score of 500 becomes a good score, will my conclusion break down? Absolutely not. Why? Because, hey, if you look at the conclusion, it's not predicated on the fact that what you call the score of 500. I mean, it's not predicated on whether the score of 500 is qualified as a good score or a bad score. In other words, you could change 500 by 700 or 720. The logic of the argument would not change. Essentially, it would still be the same. So qualifying that numerical value is a good or bad has absolutely zero impact on our conclusion, which is kind of what happens when you apply the negation test to an incorrect answer choice. Your conclusion still continues to be true. It doesn't break down. So for correct answer choice, conclusion breaks down when you negate that one. For an incorrect answer choice, the conclusion continues to hold true when you negate that particular answer. So this is just the fundamental thinking about what an assumption is. Now that we know what an assumption is, let's kind of get to a bit more challenging questions. Asim says, doesn't therefore imply, and we'll go back, Asim, thank you for the question, that 500 is bad in admission? No. What the author is saying is, Joe scored 500 on the GMAT because of that score of 500. He's not qualifying that score as good or bad. I mean, if you go to some admission consultants, Asim, and with a score of 710, and you want to say, hey, I am from such and such background, and I want to apply to, let's say, Stanford. Stanford is a school that's a sucker for high GMAT scores. And you say, I have a 710, I want to apply to Stanford. 9 out of 10 admission consultants will tell you, you will not get admission into Stanford with a 710. Okay, 710 is a great score. It's in the top 10 percentile. Yet, they'll tell you it's not enough for this. What this is saying is this score is not enough. It's not qualifying good or bad. Can you apply negation test to all assumption questions? Yes, the negation test stems from the very definition of assumption. There are no exceptions to it. Okay, with that, let's just kind of pick up the pace a bit. Let's solve more challenging arguments over here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you an argument, just an argument, no answer choices. I wanted to put in your pre-thinking in a short answer pod. I'm going to give you 2.5, 3 minutes to do that. Okay. Then I'm going to tell you how do I go about doing pre-thinking. And as you do that, we're going to come up with some assumptions for the same argument. And we're going to compare what you came up with what I came up with. In fact, as I'm going through pre-thinking, it has happened in the past sessions that you guys start coming up with really good assumptions over there. Okay. So 3 steps. I'm going to give you an argument. You're going to put in what you think is the assumption. And then I'm going to come up with my way of doing pre-thinking, and we're gonna you guys will then come up with a different set of a much better set of assumptions overall. So keep your pen and paper ready. If you need a glass of water, go get that glass of water. I'm gonna put in a short answer pod over here. Here is your short answer pod. Which is where you're going to put in your answers. And again, I've removed a broadcast result. So when you put in your answers and press enter, you won't see your answers, but I will continue to get them. So don't worry about them. Here is the argument. I'm going to mute myself for the next 2.5 minutes. Good luck, guys. All right, I have about 21 answers. Let's wait for another 10. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. Broadcast the results. Actually, I'll keep the polls open. Here's what I'm going to give you some time to read through this. The learning comes through only, not through learn. Okay, I think this statement's off. Tenured faculty focuses more on research, hence they provide better insights to any idea to students. Again, you can really see this going way beyond the argument. Tenured faculty give more importance to research than teaching because of the reward system. Okay, uh, all tenured faculty uh, place a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. Teaching efforts are linked with the reward systems. Due to the reward system, tenured professors don't pay attention. So let's some very interesting results. I think when you're saying all of these things, you're actually thinking in the right direction, which is very interesting, which is the first step. A lot of people don't think in the right direction. So let's see how I would go about doing this and how I would arrive at the answer. Okay. So the first thing you've got to understand is you've got to understand what the conclusion is. Why? Because as I said, an assumption is intimately linked to the conclusion. So we're going to isolate the statement that contains the conclusion. We're going to understand that conclusion. Then we're going to arrive at what we call as a logical structure, the reasoning that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. And then what we're going to do is we're going to ask a pre-thinking question, a singular question, which will help us arrive at multiple assumptions. Okay. So let's see what that pre-thinking question is before we identify what a conclusion is. Okay. Now remember, an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. Okay. So I'm going to come back to that must be true part over here. All right. So in other words, what you can really infer is that without an assumption, the conclusion will break down. Why? Because if an assumption has to be satisfy this must be true condition, which means that the assumption is not there, the conclusion will likely break down. There's a possibility of conclusion breaking down. In other words, an assumption is built around those scenarios that break the conclusion down, right? Why? Because an assumption is like that defender that is preventing the conclusion or defending the conclusion from really being invalidated. Does this make sense? That an assumption is built around those scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. If you were to really put that essential pillar, you would first figure out where is the roof caving in and then put an essential pillar over there, right? That's the same logic over here. Which means to figure out what an assumption is, we need to find out those scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Once you figure out those scenarios, your assumption really is those scenarios are not true or are not possible. Let's kind of do that to a simple argument that we just did and then to this particular argument. So the question that you're going to ask is, under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, does the conclusion break down? Okay, and once we do that, the answer to that would tell us the assumption. Now, we're going to ask the same question regardless of the argument. So you may want to write this question down. Under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, will the conclusion break down? There are only two things that I'll ask you to write down in this session. One is the core definition of an assumption. The second is how to formulate this falsification question. Two things. If you learn these two things, you'd be able to answer each and every assumption question correctly. Okay. So here is our argument. What I've done is I've divided this argument into three statements, and I'm going to put in a poll question over here. I want you to tell me which statement is the main conclusion. Now my poll question has four options. I reuse this question for another argument. So ignore statement 4, just focus on statements 1, 2, or 3. My question is, according to you, which statement is the main conclusion? Again, which statement is the main conclusion is the question. Now, when you see data over here, the way I have, and we have about, let's see, about 125 responses over here. Let me end this poll. What you see is are areas where people falter. And only about 50% of you've chosen the statement 2 is the main conclusion, which is the correct answer. Statement 2 is indeed the main conclusion over here. Okay, so a lot of people think statement 1 is the main conclusion, and the reason why people think that statement 1 is the main conclusion is because they see this word concludes. Now remember this, in an argument the main conclusion is always by the author. It's from the author's point of view. The question that you're trying to ask is, what does the author want you to believe? So statement 1 is not what the author concludes. Statement 1 is a conclusion by this paper. Okay, statement 1 in fact is a fact. All right, what the author wants you to conclude is statement 2, which is the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system for the former. Now let's just visualize this main conclusion over here. What the author is telling is, okay, he's saying, hey, that paper is true. I was not disputing that paper's findings. What he's saying is that, hey, don't blame professors, blame the reward system. It shouldn't say don't, it should say blame the reward system for it. He's saying the reason why tenured faculty has a lesser impact or a lower impact on student learnings is because of the reward system for tenured faculty or for professors in the tenure system. Saying that's the reason why the paper has made its conclusions. Okay, and that's something that you need to be able to visualize. Are you guys with me so far? What the author is saying is, he's not disputing the report's findings. He's saying, hey, the reason why that report exists, or the reason why that research paper had those findings, is because the way the tenured faculty are rewarded. Okay. So if you were to do what we call as the structure of the argument, this is your main conclusion. This is what the author wants you to believe. This statement is statement number 3 is a supporting statement. It's information that the author provides to make his main conclusion more believable. And the first statement over here is what we call as context. It sets the stage for the author to make his claim. Again, because the author makes his claim on this, it by definition supports the conclusion. Why? Because the conclusion is built upon it. Now I have a poll question for you. It says purely on statement number 3. Okay, whose reward system does statement 3 talk about? Does it talk about the reward system for tenured faculty? Does it talk about the reward system for lecturers? Does it talk about both their reward systems? Whose reward system does statement 3 talk about? Is it just tenured faculty? Is it just lecturers? Or is it both tenured faculty and lecturers? Think about it, put in your answers. I have 120, 124. And this is, again, let me end the poll and broadcast the results. And you really see what I'm doing is I'm kind of creating a funnel of mistakes. The first step in the funnel was identifying the conclusion. Half the people made a mistake over here. The second step in the funnel is understanding who does statement 3 talk about. And people who said tenured faculty, which is 62% of the class, you guys are absolutely right. It only talks about tenured faculty. People who say lecturers or people who say both is about 34%, but 48 of you guys are not inferring information. Let's kind of look at this. The criterion for rewarding tenured faculty typically places greater is a comparative word, emphasis on research than on teaching. So what this statement is saying is that for tenured faculty, there's probably 60% emphasis on research and 40% emphasis on teaching. So that's the greater part over here. But we only know this for tenured faculty. There is absolutely zero information for full-time lecturers. I want you to read this once again. Okay, read this once again and tell me, for those of you who said both, or those of you who said lecturers, do you now, having read this once again, do you now understand that? Yes or no? And this is where I call it the funnel of mistakes. You make a mistake in understanding the conclusion, you won't get the right answer. You make a mistake in understanding a statement, you will not get the right answer. Okay, and this is what deconstructing statement says. Okay. Now, let's kind of formulate what we call as the falsification question. The falsification question is going to be, under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will the conclusion break down? So when we really take that structure and put it into this particular argument, the question would be, under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance of these two groups, given that what we know is full-time lecturers are better than professors, and the second is the reward system for professors places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. Again, look at this question again. What this question is saying is, under what circumstances would you not blame the reward system, given that these two things still need to be true? So let's kind of figure out under what circumstances. Again, the same question over here. What are some of the scenarios in which you can't blame the reward system to be responsible? One scenario is if the non-tenured faculty has a very similar emphasis on research, which means if non-tenured faculty has an identical reward system. In that case, you can't blame the reward system for the difference in performance. Remember, the difference in performance is still true, but if both of them have the same reward system, then you can't say, hey, reward system is responsible. Do you agree? If they have the same reward system, you can't blame the reward system. Something else has to be responsible. Okay. The second falsification scenario is, hey, you may have the reward system. Most professors don't care about it. If they don't act as per the reward systems, then you can't really blame the reward system because it's not an influencing factor on how they act. So if these are scenarios in which my conclusion breaks down, what are my assumptions? Non-tenured faculty, they don't have an identical reward system. And most tenured professors care about the reward system. Okay. I'm going to keep this over here. I want to let you read this. The thing that you have to appreciate over here is that the moment you ask these questions and the moment if you understand the argument well, these answers start to come very naturally to you. And you're going to see more and more of this because you're going to solve 3 official questions right after this. But the thing which is there is, if you ask the falsification question, you can come up with these scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Once you have those scenarios, formulating assumptions is very, very, very simple. Okay. This is all mechanical. And I'm going to look at a few instances. I'm going to kind of skip through this. I want to do a few questions. Now, many of you have been asking, okay, how can I learn what a negation test is? We've actually probably written the most comprehensive article in the world on what a negation test is supposed to be. You can click on this link and Sandeep can provide that link in the Q&A pod. Also, I'm going to share the session PDF with you. Now, I'm going to talk about one more thing which may be bothering some of you, which is pre-thinking and timing. How many of you are worried about this? Like, man, Rajat is going in so much detail. How am I going to be able to do this in 2 minutes on the test? How many of you are worried about it? Pretty much everyone. And I can understand why, because this is a lot longer. I'm not trying to teach you any tricks. I'm not saying, hey, if you just focus on this particular word, here is a simple way to get to the answer. And because, hey, those tricks don't work. If you go to GMAT Club Share GMAT Experience, click on the tag e-GMAT, you're going to see 6+ pages of success stories. If you click on any other tag, 12+ pages of success stories. More than 12 pages of success stories. Each page is about 50 success stories. If you go click on any other tag, you're not going to see more than 6. In fact, you're going to see 6 pages of success story only for Magoosh. Beyond that, for every other company, you're going to see 2 pages or fewer. We would not have the success if this method took time. So here is what you're going to feel as you go through this process. This is a process. I'm not giving you a key and you're going to open a lock. It's a process. I'm giving you a rhythm. You've got to build that rhythm for yourself. Once you build it, life is going to be beautiful. Let's say you're someone who's starting with this point number 1, and let me define this point number 1. And it's a relative point because everyone's at a different starting point. Let's say your point number 1 is where your time to answer questions is medium and your accuracy is low overall. Two things will happen when you start applying pre-thinking. One is your time to answer questions will go up. And if you're taking 2 minutes, you might end up taking 3.5 minutes. That's an expectable thing. That's something that you should anticipate anyway. And you'll reach this point number 2, you will be solving more questions correctly. Yet, if you're like most students, you're going to really say, why the hell is this happening? I am already stressed about finishing the test. Why am I following this method? At that point, I would say keep faith in this method. And what's going to happen is, as you continue practicing pre-thinking, continue formulating that falsification question, you'd go from point 2 to point 3. At that point, what's going on? Your accuracy is going up. Your time to answer questions is going up. In fact, it's going in this direction where you'd be faster than what you started with. And then you'd really say, hey, now I realize why we need to do pre-thinking, how it helps me actually perform better in critical reasoning. And then as you do this, you're going to continue to get better. And that's when you'd reach that 90th percentile, which you need for that 730 or higher score. And it's not just me. There are many students, and it says upwards of 600 students who've done this. In fact, what has started to happen is even those who just attend this webinar, a few of them have taken the test and they've scored really well, and they credit their success in critical reasoning to pre-thinking. Okay. So here are some people who really some things that people have said. He said, understand the passage completely. Take your time. Equally important, pre-think and answer before looking at the answer choice. Probably this one word will have the most impact on your GMAT score. Okay. So another guy who said that, he said, answer CR questions as if there are no answer choices. Pre-thinking is a game changer. When it gets to 700 level questions, you have to do pre-thinking. The reason to do pre-thinking is to help you focus on logic and not deviate from the key argument when these kind of answer choices show up. So this is a guy who went from 700 to 770. When he had a score of 700, his pre-thinking, his critical reasoning ability was 30th percentile. In 20 days, he was able to improve to a 770. He scored 95th percentile in critical reasoning in 20 days. Why? Because he adopted pre-thinking. There's another one. It says, this pre-thinking primes the mind and we are constantly on our toes while reading an RC paragraph or a CR question stem. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating in which direction the passage will orient or what logical jump has the author taken. Here's a guy who actually had a 220-point improvement during his preparation. Now, pre-thinking, once you learn it for critical reasoning, is invaluable when it comes to reading comprehension. Okay. Now with that, let's do one more example. Now the beauty of this is an official question. It seems very simple, but if you do not do pre-thinking in this particular question, you're going to find that you're confused with multiple answer choices. So please do pre-thinking. Please formulate the falsification question. And if you formulate the falsification question, if you understand the definition of an assumption, you're going to be able to arrive at the answer very easily. Okay, make sure you have a pen and paper. And here is the question. Here is your poll. I'm going to mute myself for about 2.5 minutes. Okay, guys, last 5 seconds. Get those answers in. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. Very interesting answers. So you can see choice B was very popular, choice E was very popular, choice C was quite popular. Choices A and D were equally popular as well. Well, I mean, 7.5% of you chose choices A and D. So let's get some qualitative responses. How did you feel while selecting the answer choice? How was it? How did you feel while selecting the answer choice? Medium, confident, unsure, confused between A and B, stuck between B and E, easy, very confusing. And that's expected. That's very expected. It's a difficult question. It seems very easy, but it isn't because of the way the answer choices are formulated. So let's see how pre-thinking simplifies that confusion. And as I said, if you do pre-thinking well, you'd be able to get to the answer. Also, this is a classical example of if you think you know the definition of assumption, but you actually don't know it. And then this is a great question to clarify that definition of assumption. Okay, this is a 700 level question. Yes. Any question where the accuracy is lower than 50% is a 700 level question. So what's going on over here? So we have to finance road repairs, and the Highway Commission is considering an increase on the toll. How much increase? A 50% increase on the toll. And what's the toll? The toll is 10 cents per mile. So the toll is charged on a per mile basis, by the way, and it's 10 cents per mile. Based on this proposal, there's a highway commissioner who claims that because of this toll increase, the annual revenue generated by the highway will go up by, at a bare minimum, 50%. Okay, so that's what he's claiming. All right, so let's just visualize the conclusion as to what the author is saying. Very simple conclusion, but we still need to visualize. What he's saying is, or what the commissioner is saying is, if last year the toll highway had $1 million worth of collection of toll, this year it would at least be $1.5 million. If last year you had $10 million worth of toll collection, this year it will be about 15 million or so. So at least 15 million. It could be 15, it could be 16, it could even be 20. It'd be at least 50%. Okay. Is each one of you able to visualize this? Is each one of you able to do this? Really good. Okay. Now then the thing which is there is, if you're able to visualize this, let's kind of figure out how do we estimate annual revenue from toll? What's the formula for estimating annual revenue? Read the argument. Don't worry about the answer choices. Distance times rate. Absolutely. Yes. The way you visualize calculate annual revenue is you get the toll per mile multiplied with the total number of toll miles. Why? Because the toll is charged on a per mile basis. Okay. So it's distance time rate or total number of miles traveled multiplied by the price. Now, what are we claiming? What we are claiming is that this revenue will go up by at least 50%. Okay, we are saying that this number is going to go up by at least 50%. What we know is toll per mile will go up by 50%. So if we know all of this, this is something that we already know, that toll per mile will go up by 50%. So if that's the case, then what is the only condition required for the conclusion, or under what scenario will the conclusion break down? Okay, under what circumstances will the annual revenue not increase by 50%, provided that toll per mile has increased by 50%? The only scenario is if the total number of miles decreases. Okay, so what's my assumption? The total number of miles driven should not decrease. You guys are able to come up with this. Really good pre-thinking. Okay. So that's the only assumption. Everyone's okay with that assumption? Everyone's okay with that assumption? Good. Now let's look at why you're confused with answer choices. The first thing I'm going to really talk about is discuss an incorrect answer choice. Choice B is incorrect. Choice B is incorrect. B for boy is incorrect. What does choice B talk about? Choice B talks about the total number of trips. I know, I'm sorry about the noise, guys. My bad. Choice B talks about the total number of trips made on the toll highway will not decrease from its current level. Now, if the total number of trips decreases, if that number decreases, does it mean that the total number of miles driven would decrease? No, not really. The answer to that is not really. Okay, not really. Why? Because the total number of miles might still remain the same despite fewer trips. Okay. And thank you for those of you who are providing those answers, that Kalpana and Mohit. Thank you very much for the feedback. Okay. Why? Wow. I love the dedication, guys. Thank you very much for this. Now, let's come back to the question. My question really was, does this mean that if the total number of trips, it goes down? Let's say earlier we had, and let me put in my text over here. Earlier we had 1000 trips. Okay. Now that number goes from 1000 to 900. Does that mean that the total number of miles would go down? Does that mean the total number of miles would go down? No. Why? Why? Because if miles per trip increases, then the total number of miles will not go down, right? Distance per trip is not given to us. All right. So then the question that you have to ask is, if it doesn't mean the total number of miles would go down, then is that a must be true condition? Remember, what is the definition of an assumption? An unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid, right? Now, does this satisfy my must be true criteria? No, not really, which is why this is not the correct answer. For folks who chose choice B, and someone's really pointing out, Shreyansh is really smart, he's saying, answer choices B and C themselves make it clear that the other one is incorrect. Absolutely true, Shreyansh. The official guide wasn't smart enough to really essentially eliminate or not put one of them. Why? Because if B is true, then C has to be true too. You're absolutely correct over there. But you should know the must be true piece now. Okay, so Tony says, I'm really confused. So Tony, I'm going to try and do something for you. He says, I'm really confused. So Tony, let's go back to, and thank you for the question. Let's go back to my pillar piece over here. And I'm going to try and make a drawing over here, guys. So let's assume we kind of go back to that same roof over here. Okay. Now, remember, this is my roof, and forgive my this thing. And then this is my pillar 1. Okay. I'm going to make this as a ground. Let's call this P1. This is my pillar 2. I'm going to erase this, just 1 second. I'm going to move this away. Sorry about this, guys. Yes, I've erased this. This is my pillar 2. And this is my pillar 3. Okay, can everyone see P1, P2, and P3? Again, even though my drawing is horrible, right? right? Now, thank you very much. If to keep this roof upright, to keep this particular roof upright, I'm going to change my color over here to yellowish, orangish. I'm colorblind, so if it's orange, not yellow, then please forgive me. So if to keep this roof upright over here, I need both P1 and P3. Then is just P1 a must be true? If I need both P1 and P3, then is P1 a must be true? No, not really, right? Not really, Sebastian, which is the same thing over here. If the total number of trips, if you want that to be a must be true, then another element also has to be over there, which is the miles per trip over here, right? Does that understand? So are you sure? So that's kind of the same if you were to really draw it from an analogous standpoint. Let's look at choice E, which is our correct answer. And we're going to apply the same test, and I'm going to then look at every other answer choice as well. All right. Choice E says the total distance traveled. And okay, let me get my annotations back. Choice E talks about the total distance traveled by vehicles, which means by all vehicles on the highway, will not decrease from its current level. Now, remember, how did we estimate annual revenue? Toll per mile multiplied by total number of toll miles. If this total number of toll mile goes down, what happens to my conclusion? My conclusion breaks down. Okay, which means that this must be true. This has to be true for the conclusion to remain true. For those of you who chose choice B, can you really see how this is a must be true, whereas choice B is not a must be true? Okay. Yes, toll per mile is going to increase. That's given. Now, for those of you who are saying, how are choices B and C analogous? Choice B talks about the number of trips. Choice C talks about the length of trips, length of a particular trip. So the average length of a trip. Number of trips multiplied by average length of a trip gives you total distance. Let me actually put it in notes. I think I had a note over here. Number of trips multiplied by Can you guys see this? Number of trips multiplied by length of an average trip is the total number of is equal to total distance. Let me just do equal to over here. Is that clear? Hence, if number of trips okay, are you guys clear? If the number for choice B, again, for those of you still confused with choice B, the number of trip decreases, then the length of trip can go up to compensate for it, which means the number of trips is not a must be true. It's a good strengthener, by the way. Choices B, C, and D, they're all great strengtheners. They're not good assumptions. So these ones, if this were a strengthener question, B would have been a correct strengthener, C would have been a correct strengthener, D would have been a correct strengthener, and E would have been a correct strengthener as well. But only E is the assumption. For those of you who have chosen choice A, who are really saying, you say, why is choice A not there, not correct? Okay. Choice A. Remember, what does choice A talk about? Choice A talks about the money required for road repairs. What is the claim that the commissioner is making? Is the commissioner making any claim about the money required for road repairs? Is the commissioner making any claim? No. He's not making any claims over there. Now, if you were the commissioner, uh, uh, and essentially you were able to get 50% more revenue, but the money required was a lot more than this. Will they fire you? No, because that's not a claim that you made. What you said is, let's increase the toll by 50%, and I can assure you, you're going to get 50% more revenue. Okay. Ajay says, for me, E wasn't clear because it did not specify the combined distance traveled. Ajay, let's look at this. The total distance traveled by vehicles. What do you mean by that? This is total distance, which means all distance traveled by vehicles, not a single car, but vehicles on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. This tells me that it's the combined distance which is traveled by all vehicles. If you interpret it and if you're getting confused over here, then essentially the piece that you need to revise is inference. Okay, now we're going to go on to more difficult questions, and life is going to get more interesting now. And because these questions are more difficult, I don't want to time you. I would rather you guys time yourself. And to do this, what I'm devise a system called where we time you as a group. So I'm going to give you this answer choice where I want you to select this thing called not answered. So, but I want about 80 people to select not answered. And when 80 of you choose another answer choice, then I will call time. On 80 people to select not answered. "76, 77, 81. Perfect. I'm going to remove broadcast results. Here is your first question. Good luck, guys. All right, guys, 80% of you are done. Get those answers in. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. Now, this is a very difficult question. It's a very confusing question. It's one of those questions which does everything that the GMAT has in its power to confuse you. But if you follow pre-thinking, you would find that it's very easy to get to the correct answer. The logic used in this question is not challenging at all. In fact, you come up with assumptions on your own. Many of you would once we solve this. Now we're going to go to the next question. So I want you to follow the same exercise. Select not answered. "80 people, I want 80 of you to select not answered." Cool. Here is your question. Good luck. I'm going to mute myself again. All right, almost 80% of you are done. Let's get those answers in. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's end the poll and broadcast the results. You can really see, well, I didn't end the poll. Now I ended the poll. You can see choice D is really popular, 42%. Choice C is really popular. Choice E is very popular as well. And choice B is reasonably popular too. That is wonderful. Let's go. Okay, so let's analyze each and every question and both of these questions. I'm going to really show how you guys polled for this one. AOS Technologies. Here is how you guys polled. Choice A, 28%, choice D, 33%, choices B and C were also quite popular. Only choice E wasn't popular, which actually had nothing to do with it. So that's good. Let me move my notes part away. So let's see what's going on in this question. Okay. The conclusion is the number of Verlanders receiving special program information did not increase significantly during this time period. There are two things about this conclusion. Okay. First is it talks about actually three things. It talks about number of V's, so Verlanders. We're going to call them V. The second thing is it's only concerned with this special program information. It's not concerned with regular programs. Okay. And then it's only concerned with what happened during this time period. These are three things that are very, very important to the argument over here. So, and the reason why I want to emphasize on this is because this argument has a lot of confusing terminology. Because this has a lot of confusing terminology, people don't remember that they need to read the conclusion again. They need to figure out if essentially what the conclusion is talking about. They need to visualize it. So what this argument is saying is, if there were 1,000 people who received special program information in 94, there were 1,000 in 96. If there were 10,000 in 94, there were 10,000 in 96. Again, very similar to our prior question. Okay. Now, let's see, why does it say that? This is my conclusion. The number of Verlanders receiving special program information did not increase significantly. Okay. Let's see why it says that. There are two reasons why it says that. One is that the number of RDS equipped radios was the same in 96 as was in 94. What are RDS equipped radios? What are RDS equipped radios? These are radios which people have in their houses, or that on which people listen to programs. The second is the number of transmitting stations which had RDS technology. That more than doubled. They increased from 250 to 600. And now, because you see that these two terms are connected with the word however, which means these two terms seem to go in opposite direction, which means that this statement, statement number 2, kind of goes against the conclusion. It makes the conclusion less believable, which for those of you who've understood this argument would also understand that. And statement 1 provides the context, which says that, hey, if you want to receive this special program information, you need two things. One is you need an RDS radio, which is in your house or wherever you're listening to, and the second is essentially you need an RDS transmitting station. So that's what you need. Okay. So let's now build the logical structure of this argument. What is the author claiming? The author is claiming that the number of people receiving the special program information, or let's call them RDS programs, did not go up or did not change a whole lot between 94 and 96. Okay. Now let's see, why does the author say that? It says because between 94 and 96, the number of radios that people had, they kind of did not go up a whole lot, but the number of stations, they increased quite a bit. And to receive RDS programming, you need RDS radio. You also need, actually, you also need RDS stations. And based on this, that's what the author is saying. Is the argument structure clear, guys? Can you guys understand the argument structure? Perfect. A statement to a counterpoint, yes, it goes against the conclusion. Okay. Now, my falsification question over here is, under what conditions will there be a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming, given that there are very few additional radios that people have, but there are a lot more transmitting towers? Now, can you tell me some scenarios in which the number of people receiving this special program will go up? Can you think of certain scenarios? Let's see. How can Okay. Well, the population increased, but the radios are the same. How will the population increase uh, uh, help you do this? Okay, if the range increases, you can't say new technology which does not require RDS stations because, hey, we are given that to receive RDS programming, you need both these things. Okay, so that new technology piece is not there. Why? Because then it will go against the context, which is not allowed. Okay, one is if coverage increases. The second is more people listening to the same radio. So let's see who has said that. Asim has come up with this, which is a great one, and then Manpreet has come up with if the coverage increases. So there are two possible scenarios. If these new stations, okay, these new stations over here, if they now are deployed in places or in areas where people had the RDS radio but did not have any coverage, or if you start putting these radios in Starbucks and hence people per radio, that goes up. So instead of keeping them at home, we start putting these radios in Starbucks. Can you really see under both these scenarios your conclusion breaks down? Can you see that? Under either one of these scenarios, this or this, the author's conclusion breaks down. And you guys came up with these, by the way. So what are my assumptions? The new stations that we put in, these new stations do not increase my coverage significantly, which means they really still service the same area that the older stations were servicing. Or one of the assumptions is that the people per radio kind of remain almost the same. Look at the scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Look at how we've created assumptions based on those scenarios. Okay, let's analyze our answer choices. I'm going to put in the poll again over here. Let me show how you guys polled. Oh, where did my poll go again? Hold on, here is my poll. Here is my poll. You guys, 28% if you chose choice A, choice D was very popular, choices B and C were popular as well. Let's analyze our answer choices. Choice A for alpha is the correct answer. It's not a simple choice, so let's kind of go step by step. Choice A says few if any, which means almost none. Few if any means almost none of the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. Which are the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94? These are the new radio stations that we have. Broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios, which means they have the right kind of radios, but are living in areas not previously reached by RDS stations, which means that they were not covered. So what the choice is saying is almost none of the new radio stations increase the coverage of RDS programming. Pause over here. Can you see how this translates to this? Can you see how this translates to this? Few if any is almost none. RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94 are the new radio stations and broadcast to people not living in areas previously reached, which means that this increases the coverage. Okay, that's what this answer choice is saying. They made it to confuse you, which is, I mean, if you want to achieve 95th percentile in CR, you've got to be able to do this. Okay, so let's see if this is the correct answer. And to do that, let's negate this and see what happens to my conclusion. So the negation of this is we negate this almost none, and the negation is at least some radio stations increase coverage. If at least some radio stations increase coverage, what happens? My conclusion breaks down, which means that this answer choice passes the negation test, which means that this is my correct answer. Take a look at this. I'm going to discuss every answer choice in really good detail, but let's first look at this answer choice. Stay here for about 10 seconds. And I'm drinking coffee, by the way, in the background, in case you hear me sipping something. That's not Adobe to blame, that's me, by the way. Okay, I'm done with my coffee. All right. Choice A. Everyone clear about it? Difficult choice, probably the most challenging choice that you would get in critical reasoning, or in fact, even in reading comprehension up there. Difficult logic, difficult choice. Let's look at choice B. Choice B was reasonably popular. About 25 of you chose choice B. B for boy. B says in 1996. Now it talks about what happened in 1996. Okay. Most Verlanders who lived within the listening area of RDS station had a radio equipped to receive RDS. Ronak, we're discussing choice B. So and trust me, there is nothing called a strong contender. Choice B is wrong even if choice A were not there. Now to do that, I'm going to beat the old drum that I keep on beating. What's the definition of an assumption? Can someone write that down? What is the definition of an assumption? It is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid, right? Unstated and 100% true. Perfect. You guys are getting it. I love how you guys are so much more precise now. Now, let's see what this answer choice is saying. What this answer choice is saying is, hey, if you're a Verlander, and I'm going to put in a notes pane over here. Let's increase the font. If you are a V, Verlander is V, and you lived within area, and I know it says most, but I'm going to just take it to an extreme and say all, okay, because it's easier to explain with all, and then I'm going to come back with most. Okay, if you live within the listening area, then you had a, this is what choice B is saying over here. In a sense, if you change most to all. Are you guys okay with me saying this is what choice B is saying right now? Just for simplicity, are you guys okay with that? Just play with me for some time. Okay. Now, what is my conclusion? What is my conclusion? Do you guys remember the conclusion? The conclusion is the number of Verlanders, V's, the number of V's did not change between 1994 and 1996. You guys remember the conclusion as well? You guys remember the conclusion? Now tell me, for this conclusion to be true, is it required that 100% of V's have RDS radio? Is it required? Which means, in other words, if 20%, would the conclusion not be true if 20% of Verlanders had an RDS radio in 94 and the same 20% had the RDS radio in 96? Right? Is this 100% or even 50% or even 60% required? Is that required? Is that a must? Is that a required condition? Is it clear? Let me just put in a yes no poll because that gives me stats, and then accordingly I'm going to really emphasize on. Is it clear why the word most over here is not a must be true condition. Is that clear? Yes, no? Think about it. Think about what this choice is saying. What this choice is saying is, in 1996, what is my conclusion? My conclusion is the number of Erlanders receiving RDS programming did not change between 94 and 96. What this choice is saying is, and I'm going to clear this, what this answer choice is saying is that for that to be true, most Erlanders should have had an RDS radio in 94 itself. My question is that required for that? What if only 20% of Erlanders had an RDS radio in 1994 and 20% had an RDS radio in 1996? Would the conclusion still not be true? For those of you who are saying no, what are you confused about? What are you confused about? Okay. Remember, an assumption is something that must be true for the conclusion to hold to be valid. This answer choice in structure is the same answer choice as choice B in the prior argument where it talked about the number of trips. Was that number of trips to be same required? It's exactly the same thing. Okay. Remember, the conclusion is about the change in number of listeners from 94 to 96 and not about, hey, what was the absolute number in 94? What was the absolute number in 96? And what this one is talking about is talking about an absolute number in 96, which again is not required, is irrelevant. Choice C talks about what happens when you equip a radio station with RDS technology. Okay. Now, we don't care about it. Why? Because we need RDS technology to transmit RDS programming. Okay. So even if it decreases the station's listening area, the impact is on other programming, which is non-RDS programming. And in my conclusion, do I care about non-RDS programming? Do I care about non-RDS programming in my conclusion? No, we don't care about non-RDS programming. And this is, I mean, this is a difficult question. It's difficult to do it in 2 minutes. I gave you about 4 minutes for this. But there's just so much learning that you can get from this question that I think it's very valuable for everyone to revise it, because every answer choice, every difficult answer choice in this question is something that's the logic for that is replicated in many other difficult questions. Let's look at choice D over here. Okay, and let's read choice D slowly. If you read choice D slowly, you're gonna get it. Okay, choice D says in 1996, were landers who did not own radios equipped to receive RDS. In my conclusion, do I care about people who don't have RDS radios? Do I care about those guys? Could not receive any programming. Do I care about any programming in my conclusion? Or is my conclusion just about RDS programming? My conclusion is just about RDS programming. From any programming from RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 1994. Okay, so it discusses people who did not have the right kind of radio. It discusses the kind of programming that we are not interested in. And because of these two counts, you shouldn't even have considered this one. If you understood what the conclusion was about, if you understood the logic of the argument, you should have been able to reject this answer choice correctly. But because there were all of these terminologies which were there in the argument, you got confused. Could this be a weakener? No, this has nothing to do with my argument. Why? Because it's talking about a kind of programming that I'm not concerned about. And if I were to draw a parallel, and let's say if you, as Anshul, were aiming for an MBA program and you scored a 700, and someone told you, hey, with a score of 700, you would not get into Harvard. What this answer choice is saying is, with a score of 700, you would not even get into a master's program. Not, when I say a master's, an MSc program, not a master's of business. Okay, is that even relevant? Is that statement? This statement is talking about something which is not even an MBA. And it says with that score of 700, not just an MBA, you won't even be able to get into a master's program otherwise. Would that choice be relevant if someone were making a claim with that score of 700, you won't be able to get into Harvard MBA? Would that be relevant? No, it won't be. Which is the same thing that this is saying. It's saying it could not receive any programming. Okay. RDS registration, the kind of programming again is irrelevant. Very few of you chose to, only two of you chose this one. Okay, is pre-thinking relevant for assumption questions only or strengtheners? Anyway, so pre-thinking is relevant. The way we are doing pre-thinking, that's relevant for any argument-based questions, which means if it's relevant for assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate, fill in the blanks, boldface. For inference questions, pre-thinking is relevant in certain cases, not in all, but for every argument-based question, which is about 90% of all CR, it's very relevant. Avanish says, should we read all answer choices if we think an answer choice is correct? That's a great question, Avanish, and that's something which right now, so this is something which I will tell you what's going to happen. When many of you are in that learning phase right now, and when you're in that learning phase, don't worry about answering question in the shortest amount of time. Worry about building a consistent method that will help you get to answer most questions correctly. Worry about building a consistent method that will tell you if you made a mistake, at which step you made a mistake. Now, as you continue doing that, as you build that consistent method and as you practice properly using that consistent method, your brain will automatically answer that question, Anvesh, that, not Avnish, sorry, Anvesh, that should you continue to read other answer choices? Because what's going to happen is sometimes you pre-think something, you have such strong conviction and you see the exact same answer choices. In that case, you probably don't even need to worry about it. But at other times, you might pre-think something and you might not be super confident about what your pre-thinking is, and in that case you may have to. So there is no single answer to it, but you will know if you practice this approach when to do this and when not to do this. So, and it's not a major answer, major deciding point, Anvesh. Okay, so okay, Shelby, this is a very interesting question. I'm going to share. I'm going to share the stats first of all as to how you guys did that. 42% of you chose choice D for Delta, and 42% of you are correct in this case. Choice C was very popular, and let's see, choice E is very popular as well, as is choice B for boy. Now, a lot of people get this answer correct. This is still a 700 level question. The accuracy is still 42% only. But they don't get it right for the right reasons, and which is where, okay, Asim says in the previous example, if there were an answer choice which says multiple people are listening to the same radio, in that case, which one would we put in? It would not be the case, Asim. If an argument has multiple assumptions, you will see only one. Okay, if you see more than one, let me know. I will contact the GMAT directly. I have not seen a single answer choice where that happens. So it won't happen. But good question. I understand how that can help you. That can confuse you. Sorry about that. So what's going over here? Here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the amount of refuse. So last year we collected a lot of garbage, and we did not recycle anything. We actually burnt everything. Okay. And this argument is a classic example of how the author will share some context with you. He will not continue that context, but what he's going to find is that that particular context essentially carries on, okay, along with the argument and in many of your minds. So last year, let's assume that each garbage can is uh, is 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 one truck. So how many trucks did we send for incineration last year? Can you look at this and tell me how many trucks would we send for incineration? Okay, 10, right? 10 trucks. Now, this year, if we collect the same amount of garbage, how many trucks do you think we'll send for incineration? We are going to send about 5 trucks for incineration, right? We're going to send about 5 trucks. Now, here is the question that I want you to answer. I'm going to put in a poll over here. If instead of the same amount of garbage, if we collect 10 times as much garbage, if we collect 10x as much garbage, then how many trucks do you think we'll send for incineration? So once again, if we collect 10x, this is 10 times as much garbage, then how many trucks do you think we will send for incineration? Three, two, and 1. And the answer to this question will tell me whether you've understood this argument correctly. The question is, if you collect 10 times as much garbage, how many trucks would you send for incineration? Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. And you guys have done really well. The correct answer is choice A, which is still just 5 trucks, not 50, but 5. And let's see why we say this over here. Let's look at the last line. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse two is a purpose word. With the purpose, enough refuse to reduce the number of truckloads to be incinerated to half of last year's number. What they're really saying, if you read this, is if you sent 10 trucks last year, regardless of the amount of garbage collected, I'm only going to send 5 trucks for incineration. Read this once again. Can you see that? Can you see this over here? To half of last year's number. This has been given to you as a fact. Okay. So even if you collect 10 times as much refuse, you're still only going to get 5 trucks. This is your main conclusion. We're going to follow the same process over here. We're going to ask ourselves, okay, the argument structure says how we're going to send half as many trucks. We'll recycle the remaining. Last year, all of this was burned, and burning generated a lot of ash. And the conclusion is this year we want to generate half of ash as was generated last year. The question that we're going to ask is, under what condition will the ash generated be greater than 50%, even if we only send half as many trucks for incineration? Okay, what are the conditions? If the ash generated per truckload is higher, this year is higher than that generated last year. The only way in which the ash generated would be greater than 50% is that on an average per truckload, we generate more ash. Is that clear? That's the only possible scenario in which the conclusion will break down, right? So what's my assumption? The assumption is that ash per truckload is similar to or lower than what was generated last year. That's my assumption. The ash per truckload has to be very similar to what was generated last year, or it is going to be lower than what was generated last year. Okay. So which is your choice? D. Now let's look at every answer choice over here and really see why the other answer choices are not correct. Choice A says this year no materials that city services could separate for recycling will be incinerated. Again, we are given that, hey, if you separate materials for recycling, it would not be incinerated overall. This is something that's given. All right, this information can be inferred. Would the amount of recycled refuse? No, it doesn't. Why? Because the choice B talks about the cost. We're going to look at every answer choice, so stay connected. Choice C talks about the proportion of recyclable materials. We don't care about proportion of recyclable materials. Why? Because it compares this year versus last year. Why? Because we will only get 5 truckloads to be sent for incineration. Even if the proportion is higher, what's been told to us is we are only going to get 5 truckloads for incineration. Okay. For those of you who chose choice C, a lot of you chose choice C. Is that clear? For those of you who chose choice C, C for cat. Choice D, which is our correct answer, talks about how much ash will we generate per truckload, okay, which is what we talked about, same as our pre-thinking. And choice E, and you can negate this, if every truckload generates more ash, then my conclusion will break down. Ishan says, why do you not consider the amount that can be recycled? Ishan, what is my conclusion? What is my conclusion? Ash, right? How much ash will I generate? What generates ash? Incineration, right? What generates ash? Incineration or burning generates ash. Conclusion is ash, and which is by incineration, right? By incineration of refuse. Now, what do we know about, and I'll be sharing the slides. How do we how do we generate ash? What's true this year? True this year is that we're only going to send half as many truckloads, right? We're only going to send half as many truckloads, which means the proportion of recyclable materials is immaterial. Well, for those who are saying the argument never said we incinerated, let me just share the argument with you over here. Last year, all refuse collected by Shelbyville City Services was incinerated. Why 2? Can you see this? The first line. Okay. Yes, this incineration generated a large quantity of residual ash. That's clearly given to you as second line. I'm going to share the slides in about 5 minutes, right, guys? Choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. Okay, it compares the total quantity. Was it doesn't impact. Why? We just even if you collect 10 times as much refuse, since you're only going to get half as many trucks, it doesn't matter. If you want to apply the negation test to this to really say total quantity of refuse would be greater this year, does it have an impact on my conclusion? No, it doesn't have any impact. Why? Because we only send half as many truckloads. Okay. Now we're done with all the questions. Let's see, what do you do next? All right. Thing that I want you to take away from this is, hey, this isn't rocket science. This is a process. It's a method. You follow this method, you ace critical reasoning. You do pre-thinking, you can cut away the noise, and you can be super precise. Okay. If you're not a paid student, you have a few free video lessons that you should go right after this to make sure you cement your learning. Make sure you go through introduction to assumption, make sure you go through logical gap, two entities, and make sure you go through this practice file. Actually, this is way more information that you would get from any other resource, even if you pay for it, by the way. And then this has each of these files as examples, super detailed solutions that you would rarely see over here. Okay. If you're a paid student, don't jump onto it right away. Make sure you go through the inference module first. Okay. Why? Because if you're confused with answer choices, the inference module is designed to make sure you learn what each and every individual statement says. So make sure you first finish the inference module, then you go into assumption, then you go into evaluate, then strengthen, then weaken, then boldface, then so on and so forth. Okay, and in each module, make sure you first go through the concept files, concept quizzes, then application file, then practice quizzes, and then the official questions, which if you feel the need, only then go through them, because there's enough questions in this part over here. And I'm going to tell you how many more questions are there. But at each point, every concept file assesses you, gives you feedback that's personalized to you. Every concept quiz assesses you, gives you feedback that's personalized to you, as does every application and practice file. Okay. Use that feedback. Based on what you see on the feedback screen, make those adjustments. And essentially, as you move forward, you should continuously get better if you incorporate that feedback. Okay. Now, just to really tell you, as you go through this, you'd encounter more than 500 full-length practice questions. These are e-GMAT created practice questions. None of these questions is an official question, by the way. Okay. And just to really tell you this, the overall learning nuggets that we have, it's a learning architecture in which you learn a few concepts, you learn how to apply a few concepts, and then we evaluate you, tell you how well you're doing before you move on to the next set of concepts. It's what we call as an integrated learning and assessment nugget, and which has feedback at conceptual level, at application level, as well as at an entire module level that you really see. In critical reasoning, for example, you have about 10 modules. Okay. If you are a paid student, this is your chart. You go through all of this just an assumption. Okay. Which means you go through the core concepts here, you go through level 1 application here, level 2 application here, and let's say level 1, level 2, it's increasing difficulty of intensity. And then you do another last set of practice. I mean, as you're going through here, and here, you will have already practiced about 50 assumptions, questions here, or even more. And then you're supposed to go through a few live sessions if you had live sessions. Yep. So how do you get to 100+ point score improvement? You solve every question using pre-thinking. Build your pre-thinking muscle. Don't worry about timing early on. Okay. Practice OG questions if you need to. You should not. But don't just do random practice on official questions. And then make sure you hit 80% in every concept and application file. If you don't hit that 80%, go back, revise the relevant portions, make notes. If you have a doubt, every concept has its own dedicated forum where you can see what doubts others have had, and you can post a question. If you post a question, one of our subject matter experts will respond to it within 24 hours. Okay. Even when you get a question correct, look at the detailed solution and make sure you've chosen the correct answer for the right reasons. As we talked about in this webinar, it's not important just to get the answer right. It's important to make sure that you understand why you've gotten it right, because hey, you might have gotten lucky here, but in this particular instance, but if you don't choose the correct answer for the right reasons, the test will trick you. Okay. Just to really tell you how comprehensive this is, the e-GMAT CR course has 524 questions, and you compare this to the Power Score book or the Manhattan book, you're going to really see it's many times more. Actually, if you're going to compare it to the OG, it's about 3 times as many questions. Okay. And there's some example of students who've done this very quickly. It doesn't require months to ace pre-thinking. You can do it in days. All right. Anupriya was able to get to a V46, which is 99 percentile on GMAT Verbal, in about 20 days. Okay. The goal for her, the reason why she did that was because A, she perfected the approach, B, every question that she solved, and she didn't solve a lot of questions, by the way, she focused on looking at the solutions. She focused on making sure that she got them correct for the correct reasons. And she did one section till she achieved that 90th percentile. Here's another student, Karthik. You can watch his interview on our YouTube channel, and where you can watch about 100 other interviews. Um, he really said, as someone who's taught physics at an undergraduate level, I thought I had a very good grasp on logic. But on the GMAT, language has this, they use language to fool you, to make you think that you have the right answer when you don't. And he says, by doing pre-thinking, you're able to help me understand those traps and overcome most of those traps. There's a guy who went from 570 to 740. Okay. Again, what should you do next? Make sure you go through these files next. With that, let me share the session PDF. Overall, has a session handout that you guys can download over here. And once again, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those questions. In this short answer poll, if you could also give me some feedback on what you learned from the webinar, that would be great. Okay, and let me share our details for upcoming sessions. Here are the details for upcoming sessions that you can register for. Okay, so after completing a one-year MBA program, do you get a good job? Yes, HEC Paris, I think, is a really great school. So yeah, you should. Again, guys, I'd appreciate some feedback. I'd appreciate what you learned over here. That'd be really, really good. Okay. Understanding and interpreting the conclusion is holy grail. That's good. Reinforce some of the concepts. Learn about the importance of pre-thinking. That's really, really great. Let me focus not to focus on information that's not in the conclusion. Well, you should focus on some of it, but I think I understand what you're saying, because there's a lot of information that a lot of direction, the many directions where your brain can go in, and pre-thinking definitely channelizes your energy to get there. So take a look at the free trial, take a look at the CR concepts in the free trial, and do that. Rahul says, do you think it's too late to apply for the first round of GMAT scheduled for 25th of August? Depends on which schools you're applying to, Rahul. R1 goes all the way till October, so it's not too late. But if you want to apply to Harvard, then yes, it probably is. So again, it varies from school to school, but the rule of thumb that I will tell you is that essentially give yourself about 20 days to 25 days to craft a great application. Remember, getting a letter of recommendation also requires time. So that would be my litmus thumb, my rule. What's the major difference between round one and round two? For most students, there probably shouldn't be a major difference, is what I would say. For most students, there shouldn't be. The only thing is round one is slightly better with regards to the number of seats that are available. But I can tell you that when I applied to B school, and you can really read about many B school experiences over here on our YouTube channel. But when I applied in round one, even though I had a great GMAT score in round one, I was done with my GMAT before round one. I didn't get into a single school in round one. Why? Because my application wasn't ready. In round two, I got into every school I applied to. I got full fellowships. Actually, I got three full fellowships in round two. So for me, and based on my experience with upwards of 50,000 paying students that we've had over the last 10 years, round one versus round two, there's probably about 5 to 7% delta, not a whole lot. Round two versus round three is a completely different picture. But even in round three, there are seats available. Sanjeev, thank you for the praise. So I am going to share, as you said, that over here in a public forum. Thank you. Um, so yeah, Rahul, hopefully that gives you a framework to see whether you can apply or not. Okay. With that, I will see, or Payal will see many of you guys tomorrow in the algebra session. And again, I want to actually ask one other question, since I have 100 of you here, so just don't go. It's a yes/no question. I want to ask you, how many of you have Zoom installed on your computer? Because some of you faced issues. How many of you have Zoom installed? Zoom, the desktop, the video conferencing app on your PC. How many of you have that installed? Because that's another option that we could go to, other than Adobe Connect. In fact, Adobe Connect is the world's most expensive video conferencing software. It costs about $5,000 for the year, which Zoom, by the way, costs about 500 for the year. But it gives us all of these great polling options, which is why we love Adobe Connect. Avnish says no Zoom. Why Avnish? Why no Zoom? I mean, we use Zoom internally. We've been using Zoom for the last 8 years within e-GMAT. So yeah, Microsoft Teams doesn't scale up really well. I mean, Microsoft doesn't have really good what shall I say? Even though I mean, we use Teams internally as well, so we are a Microsoft shop internally. But even then, we pay for Zoom subscription because Teams not as reliable when we use it internally. So yeah, I mean, even though we have Teams free of charge, we use it for our work management. We do not use Teams for video conferencing. It just hasn't been as reliable as Zoom is. And Zoom has been reliable ever since 2012, by the way. So we were amongst the first 1,000 customers that Zoom had. Okay. I see some of you saying this is a brilliant app. Why to saying, yeah, I mean, we love Adobe Connect. I mean, the kind of polling facility, the way that it's very low bandwidth. I mean, we love it, which is why we pay for this, and even though it's very expensive. The webinar room costs so much, but it's just that because of audio troubles with the browser, that's where I want to make sure. I see a question here. I have a 3.15 CGPA out of 4. Will a great GMAT compensate? Yes, it will. And there are some articles that you can see on YouTube, which not on YouTube, sorry, some on. Let me just share this article over here. GMAT versus GPA. This is going to go against Avnish's name, so but you can really see the importance of GPA. And yes, you will get the recording in an email in by 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, which is my time, and or 6 a.m. Indian. I think 5:30 p.m. Pacific is probably like 3 a.m. UK. So Suparth, you get a recording. You'll also see a recording on YouTube. So if you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, you should be seeing that over there as well. Okay. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, guys, and appreciate all the feedback on Teams versus Zoom versus Adobe Connect. I mean, this was very helpful for us when it comes to making decisions. Thank you very much. And again, we're going to continue to seek feedback and you know, if it's very reliable with the with downloading the application, and that's what we'll do. Thank you and bye bye and have a good day. I will see you tomorrow.